The snow fell like silence, given weight. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of the last street lamp, a shape lay motionless against the white earth. Small, still. Wrong in the way that only a body can be wrong when it belongs somewhere warm and instead lies folded against frozen ground near a river that had stopped speaking weeks ago beneath its armor of ice. A man ran toward it. He carried something alive against his chest, a dog young and trembling its breath coming in sharp, broken bursts that left tiny clouds dissolving in the dark. His boots drove through knee-deep snow, each stride fueled by something deeper than training. His face was tight, jaw-locked eyes fixed on the shape ahead, with a recognition that had nothing to do with sight. He had been here before. Not this exact place. Not this exact night. But the feeling was the same. That sickening lurch when the world narrows to a single point and everything else falls away like debris from an explosion. The shape did not move. The dog in his arms let out a sound thin and desperate, not a bark, but a cry, and twisted toward the figure in the snow with a ferocity that almost broke his grip. Its small paws clawed at the air. He ran faster. There are winter nights when death does not arrive with thunder. It arrives with silence. It settles over a park bench, over a frozen riverbank, over the last breath of someone who trusted the wrong people. And the only thing standing between that silence and its completion is the sound of boots in snow and the heartbeat of a creature too small to save anyone. Except it did. 2 weeks earlier, the story began the way most rescues do. Not with courage, not with a plan, with a sound no one else was listening for. The town became like all northern towns after November, a place defined by what it lacked: color, movement, warmth. Houses along the river sat low beneath early snow chimneys, threading pale smoke into a sky the color of old pewter. Cars passed, only occasionally tires hissing against frozen asphalt, and by nightfall the streets emptied as if the cold itself had issued a curfew. Riverside Park stretched along the eastern bank like a held breath. Walking paths dusted white lamps, spaced far apart and glowing a tired amber, each surrounded by a small halo of falling frost. In summer, the park held families' joggers, dogs chasing frisbees across the wide lawn near the pavilion. In December, it held nothing but cold air-bare trees and the occasional figure moving through lamplight. Callum Rowe was that figure tonight. He ran the way he always ran, alone, after dark, without music or destination. His route traced the river path from the stone bridge to the old dock and back a 5-mile loop he had memorized so thoroughly that his body could complete it without instruction from his mind. That was the point. The body moved, so the mind could rest, or at least go quiet long enough to let him breathe without feeling like each inhale was borrowing time from someone who no longer needed it. At 40, he still carried the architecture of the man he had been. Just under 6'1" broad across the shoulders without bulk, the kind of frame built by years of functional discipline rather than vanity. His posture never softened. Spine-aligned, chin-level arms, swinging in controlled arcs that wasted nothing. His dark brown hair was cut into a neat undercut beneath a black knit cap, and his jaw was clean-shaven angular in a way that caught shadow and held it. But it was his eyes that told the real story. Blue-gray and deep-set, they carried a stillness most people mistook for calm. It was not calm. It was the stillness of water held behind a dam. Controlled, pressurized, one crack away from flooding everything downstream. Tonight, the temperature had slipped below -5 Celsius, cold enough that every sound felt sharper, cleaner, as if the air itself had been polished down to its bones. His boots tan military issue built for rough ground and cold weather pressed into packed snow with a rhythmic crunch that was the only sound for half a mile in any direction. He wore the same kit he always wore. Long-sleeved camouflage top fitted close to the body, matching trousers tucked into boots, dark tactical belt at his waist holding a compact pouch and a utility case. On his wrist, a metal watch with a black face caught the lamplight once briefly like a signal no one was meant to see. This was not training. Training had purpose. This was ritual. A way to exhaust the body until the mind loosened its grip on the images it kept locked behind his eyes. A way to outrun memories that returned uninvited night after night with the patience of something that knew it would never have to hurry, because it had already won. Twisted metal under a winter sky, flashing lights on wet pavement. A voice, her voice, mid-sentence, mid-laugh, cut off as cleanly as if someone had reached into the air and pressed a button marked silence. Lena. She had died 2 winters ago on the highway 4 miles east of this park. Black ice beneath fresh snow. A delivery truck that crossed the median without warning its driver asleep at the wheel, and the mathematics of velocity and mass had done the rest in under 2 seconds. The kind of sudden loss that leaves no room for last words or preparation or the luxury of goodbye. One moment she was beside him, her hand resting on the center console. Her voice filling the cab with something he could not now remember the words to, but could still feel the exact shape of against the inside of his chest. The next moment, she was gone. Not slowly, not gradually. Gone the way a candle goes when a window opens in a storm. And the space she left did not close. It stayed open, a wound shaped exactly like her cold air moving through it at all hours. And Callum had spent every night since trying to outrun the draft that blew through the center of his life. He did not speak about it. He did not need to. Grief lived in his muscles now, in the way he pushed himself through cold nights until his lungs burned, in the way he chose routes that passed places he could not bring himself to avoid, in the silence that filled his house like standing water, rising slowly, drowning everything it touched. He had cleared the house within a month of the funeral. Her clothes, her books, the photographs she had hung with a carpenter's precision on every available wall, the coffee mug with the chipped rim she refused to throw away because she said imperfect things deserved to be kept. The half-finished crossword puzzle on the nightstand, her pen still resting in the fold. All boxed and sealed in a storage unit across town that he paid for monthly and never once visited. He told himself it was practical. He did not tell himself the truth, which was that he could not breathe in a room that still held the faint ghost of her shampoo in the curtains. Now the house held furniture and function and nothing else. No photographs, no decorations, no evidence anyone had ever lived there who expected to stay. The emptiness was not an absence, it was a choice. And he maintained it with the same discipline he applied to his body, his route, his solitude. He ran harder. The park opened around him in shades of white and amber. The river moved to his left, felt more than seen a dark presence beneath its thickening skin of ice. Snow fell in deliberate flakes, the kind that accumulate without announcing themselves until the world is buried, and no one can say exactly when it happened. He was nearing the far end of the loop where the path curved toward bare oaks, and the lamps thinned when something interrupted the rhythm of the night. Not a sound he recognized, not ice cracking or branches scraping. Softer, wet, uneven. A struggling noise like air being pulled through something damaged and too small to contain it. Callum slowed without thinking. 14 years in the teams had wired him this way. Sound meant information. Anomaly meant threat or need. The distinction came later after the body had already begun to move. He stopped, turned his head, listened with the full weight of his attention. A rasp. A pause that lasted too long. Then another strained inhale, thinner than the last, as if whatever was making it had less air to work with than a moment before. It was not a bark. It was not the wind. It was coming from the bench. The old wooden bench sat 30 feet off the main path beneath the largest oak. Its slats were coated in frost, and shadows pooled beneath it like dark water collecting in a low place. Callum stepped off the path boots, sinking into fresh powder, and moved toward it the way he had once moved toward uncleared doorways in buildings where anything could be waiting on the other side. Controlled, balanced, every sense open. He crouched. The movement was smooth despite the cold. Under the bench, pressed flat against the frozen ground as if trying to disappear into the earth itself, was a shape so small it seemed like a trick of shadow. Something that might dissolve if he looked away. He did not look away. A puppy. German Shepherd. Black and tan. No more than 2 months old. Fur matted with snow and damp clumped against ribs far too easy to count. One ear folded flat against its skull, the other struggling to lift and failing. Muzzle darkened by melted frost, breath puffing in short, ragged bursts that rattled faintly in its chest like a door loose on rusted hinges. The puppy saw him. Its eyes opened wider amber and enormous in that skeletal face and locked onto his with an intensity that sent something sharp through Callum's chest, a sensation uncomfortably close to panic. No fear in that gaze, no aggression, only urgency. The look he had seen in wounded men on foreign soil who knew they had seconds, not minutes, and were spending every one of those seconds searching for the single face that might change the outcome. The puppy tried to stand. Front paws trembled, pushed against frozen earth, found purchase for half a second, then slid. One lurching step, another. Then legs buckled, sending it into the snow with a soft, defeated thump. No cry. Just the quiet sound of a body that has reached the end of what it can do alone. But it lifted its head again, eyes still on him, still asking. Callum lowered himself fully, one knee in snow, gloved hands open. "Hey," he said, rough from cold, from disuse. He could not remember the last time he had spoken aloud to anything living. "Easy." The puppy dragged itself forward 2 inches 3, leaving a shallow groove in the snow. Sides heaving. A cough shook its frame wet and tearing. Then it reached his hand. Cold nose pressed against his glove. One sniff. And it leaned into him. Simply shifted its weight forward until its head rested against his wrist. And stopped. The decision made. As if to say, you are late, but you are here. Behind closed eyes, Callum saw Lena, kneeling on a sidewalk in weather much like this coat too thin, because she never dressed warmly enough, hands outstretched toward a stray she had spotted from across the street. Her laugh bright and unreasonable against the cold. The way she looked up at him with that expression, he could never refuse the one that said, "We are taking this one home, and you already know it." He opened his eyes. Lena was gone. The puppy was not. He shrugged out of his outer layer. The camouflage fabric was stiff against his fingers as he folded it into a cradle and scooped the puppy up in one careful motion, pressing the small, trembling body against his chest. He rapped until only the dark muzzle and amber eyes remained visible. The puppy tensed for 1 second, a survival reflex, then relaxed completely, burrowing its nose beneath his collarbone into the warmth where his heartbeat lived. It let out a single breath that shuddered through its entire frame. Its heart was frantic against his ribs, a desperate flutter like a bird trapped behind glass. "You picked a bad night," Callum said quietly. The words meant for both of them. He stood, one arm firm beneath the puppy, the other shielding its back from wind. Cold hit his exposed torso immediately, but he did not flinch. He had been colder in worse places for worse reasons. Halfway back toward the entrance, the puppy suddenly lifted its head and stiffened. A broken sound from its throat, not a bark. A warning. It twisted in his arms, eyes fixed on the far side of the path where trees thickened and lamplight failed to reach. Callum stopped, scanned. Nothing. No movement. No figure. Wind rattled bare branches overhead. Snow continued its indifferent descent, but the puppy trembled with a certainty out of proportion to its size, nose working furiously, pulling information from frozen air. Its body, too weak to walk 10 feet, pressed harder against him, not seeking warmth now, pressing away from whatever it sensed in those shadows, something it recognized, something it had met before. 10 seconds. Then the moment broke. The puppy sagged exhaustion, winning. Callum walked on, but his eyes returned to the dark tree line once more, before the park released him into the street. Someone had been there. He did not know how he knew. But the certainty settled in the way cold settles into stone. Slowly. Completely. Without apology. His house sat dark at the edge of town. Inside, cold air and stillness. He set the puppy on a towel near the vent and built a fire. Kindling first, then split logs, same precision he applied to everything. The puppy tried to follow him across the floor, paws slipping on hardwood. 4 steps, then collapse. It lay where it fell, eyes tracking him across the room with a focus that never broke. He dried its fur slowly, careful not to shock the small body, filled a shallow bowl with warm water. The puppy drank in desperate laps, ending in a cough that shook its entire frame. He moved it onto a blanket near the hearth. One last shiver nose to tail, then it curled tight muzzle tucked against its own chest. He noticed the collar. Thin gray fabric frayed at the edges, snapped or cut no tag. Someone had put it there once, taken responsibility, then stopped. His hand rested on the puppy's back, heat returning slowly beneath damp fur, heartbeat easing from frantic to merely fast. "You're safe for now," he said, not entirely convinced, but meaning it. The night passed in fragments. He dozed in the chair boots on waking at every cough and shift. Once before dawn, the puppy struggled upright, took 3 unsteady steps toward his chair, and collapsed against his boot. Callum lifted it gently into his lap and held it there, one hand covering its back, feeling the small heart hammer against his palm until the rhythm slowed. The puppy pressed its face into the crook of his elbow and went still with a trust so complete, so unearned, that it made his throat close tight around something he could not name and did not try to. He did not sleep again after that. This was the first night in 2 years that Callum Rowe stayed awake for something other than his own ghosts. By morning, pale light filtered through the windows. He wrapped the puppy in towel and jacket both and carried it to the truck. The veterinary clinic sat near the main road, a low building with wide windows and a faded sign. Dr. Elise Thorne met him at the counter. She was of average height, compact and practical, with warm brown hair pulled into a low bun and clear hazel eyes that missed very little. She wore a white veterinary coat over dark trousers, sleeves rolled to free her hands. She took in the situation with a single glance. "You found him outside," she said, not a question. "Last night, parked by the river." She led him to the exam room and worked with efficient, gentle hands. When the stethoscope touched the puppy's chest, it whimpered once softly, then fell silent eyes, locking onto Callum and not moving. Elise noticed the reaction. She did not comment on it. Not yet. "Respiratory infection," she said after a moment. "Upper airway. Hear that wheeze that does not develop from a single cold night. This has been building over time. Repeated exposure. Cold damp conditions over weeks, not hours." She turned the puppy's neck, gently revealing a faint, pale indentation beneath the fur. "See this something narrow was tied here. Rope or a cheap collar. Too tight for too long." She examined the paws next. Grime packed between the pads, nails worn at uneven angles. "He has been outside far more than any puppy this age should be. This is not a dog that slipped through an open gate one time." She reached for her chip scanner and passed it over the puppy's shoulder. The device beeped. Elise turned to her computer fingers, moving quickly across the keyboard. She read the screen quietly for a moment, her expression shifting in a way that was almost imperceptible, but not quite. "He is registered," she said. "Name on file is Hilda Soren. Address on record puts her across town near the River District." She paused, reading further. "There is a note attached to the file. Health status listed as unstable." Callum looked down at the puppy resting against his chest. Amber eyes half closed with exhaustion, one ear making its small, hopeless attempt to stand on its own. "Unstable how?" he asked. Elise shook her head. "It does not specify. That in itself is unusual." She closed the file and met his eyes directly. "We can contact her or go through animal services. There are procedures." Callum nodded slowly. But he was not thinking about procedures. He was thinking about the bench in the dark, the shadows between the trees, the frayed collar with no tag, the indentation on the neck where something narrow had been tied tight enough to leave a mark that had not yet faded, the way the puppy had stared into the darkness as if it recognized what was standing there. This puppy had not wandered away from a warm home on an unlucky night. It had been put outside, deliberately. And based on everything Elise had shown him, the layered infection, the repeated exposure, the worn paws, it had happened before. More than once. He gathered the small body carefully against his chest. The puppy burrowed in without hesitation, nose finding the now familiar spot beneath his collarbone, its heartbeat steady against his own for the first time since he had found it shaking under a bench in the dark. He needed a name, something for this creature that kept returning to him, circling back no matter where he set it down, refusing to settle unless he was close, always near, always orbiting. "Nova," he said quietly, almost to himself. The word felt right in a way he did not try to examine too closely. Small, bright. The kind of light that appears without warning in the coldest part of the sky and refuses to explain itself or apologize for arriving late. Nova flicked one ear, the working one. It was not much, but it was enough. Callum started the engine and turned toward the address Elise had given him. Toward Hilda Soren, toward the words health status unstable, and whatever waited behind them, toward a house where someone had tied a collar too tight around a puppy's neck, and then, when that was not enough, had carried it to a frozen park and left it beneath a bench to die. The questions were only beginning, and the answers he suspected would be far worse than the silence they had so carefully been hiding behind. He was already in too deep to walk away. The fire had burned down to a low, steady glow by the time Callum returned from the clinic. He carried Nova inside with one arm the other holding a paper bag of medication Elise had pressed into his hand at the door. Antibiotics, anti-inflammatory drops, a printed sheet of instructions written in her neat, unhurried handwriting. Keep him warm, keep him calm, come back tomorrow. He set Nova down on the blanket near the hearth and knelt to rebuild the fire. The puppy watched him from the folds of fabric amber eyes, tracking every movement with an attention that seemed impossible for an animal this young and this sick. When Callum reached for the kindling box, Nova lifted his head. When Callum struck the lighter, Nova's one working ear rotated toward the sound. When the flame caught and the first thin tendril of warmth reached across the floor, Nova let out a long, shuddering sigh and rested his chin on his paws. It was the sound of something deciding to stay. Callum sat back against the base of the chair legs, stretched toward the hearth, and watched the fire settle into its rhythm. The house was quiet in the way it always was, but tonight the quality of that quiet had changed. It was no longer the silence of absence. It was the silence of two living things breathing in the same room, adjusting to the weight of each other's presence. Nova slept for most of that first full day. His breathing was still uneven, the wheeze audible each time his small ribs expanded. But the desperate edge had softened into something that sounded less like drowning and more like effort. He woke in short intervals, drank water from the bowl Callum kept filled beside the blanket, ate a few bites of the soft food Elise had recommended, and then returned to sleep with the single-minded focus of a body pouring everything it had into repair. But even in sleep, he oriented toward Callum. Always. His nose pointed in the direction of whatever room Callum occupied. If Callum moved to the kitchen, Nova's head would shift on the blanket, tracking the sound of boots on wood. If Callum sat in the chair by the window, Nova would drag himself across the floor on unsteady legs until he was close enough to rest his chin on Callum's boot. It was not neediness. It was navigation, as if Callum had become the fixed point around which the puppy organized his entire understanding of safety. On the second morning, something small and unexpected happened. Callum was standing at the kitchen counter pouring coffee he would drink black and too hot the way he always did when he heard a sound behind him. Not the wheeze, not a cough. A thump, followed by the scrabble of claws on hardwood, followed by another thump. He turned. Nova was standing, all four legs beneath him trembling but locked. His tail, which had hung limp and motionless since the night in the park, gave a single tentative wag. Just one. A half arc that barely disturbed the air. But it was there. Callum set the mug down slowly. He did not move toward the puppy. He simply stood and watched as Nova took one step, then two, then a third that ended in a stumble, but not a fall. The puppy recovered, looked up at Callum, and wagged again. Twice this time. Good, Callum said. His voice sounded strange to him. Not rough, not clipped, just quiet in the way a person speaks when they are afraid of breaking something by speaking too loudly. He realized he had been talking to Nova more in the past 36 hours than he had spoken to any human being in the past 6 months. Small things. Observations about the weather. Commentary on the fire. A running narration of what he was doing as he moved through the kitchen as if Nova were a partner who needed to be kept informed. Once absurdly an apology for the quality of the food. Once even more absurdly a brief explanation of why he preferred his coffee black, delivered in the same even tone he had once used to brief teams before operations. The words came without planning, drawn out of him by the simple fact of being watched by something that expected nothing from him except presence. It occurred to him standing there with a mug growing cold in his hand and a sick puppy watching him from across the room that this was the first time since Lena's death that silence in this house had felt like something other than an accusation. It was not that the silence was gone. It was that something living was sharing it with him, and that changed its weight entirely. That afternoon, he took Nova back to Elise for a follow-up. She listened to the puppy's chest, checked the throat, examined the paws again. Her expression was careful. "Better," she said, "but I want to show you something." She turned Nova gently on the exam table, parting the fur along his left side. Beneath the coat, hidden by the angle and the thickness of puppy fur, was a mark Callum had not seen before. Not the ligature line on the neck. Something different. A patch of skin where the fur grew thin and uneven, the tissue beneath slightly raised. It was roughly the size of a man's thumb. "That is not from cold exposure," Elise said. Her voice was level professional, but her eyes had hardened. "That is a contact burn, older than the other injuries, weeks, possibly a month." Callum stared at the mark. His hands resting on the edge of the table went very still. "Someone did this deliberately," he said, not a question. "I cannot say that with medical certainty," Elise replied. "What I can say is that this injury did not occur naturally, and it is consistent with repeated mistreatment over an extended period." She paused. "I am documenting everything. Photographs, measurements, timeline. Whatever you decide to do with this information, the record will be complete." She met his eyes and held them. "Patterns matter, Callum. They always do." Nova sat quietly on the table between them, his breathing slightly better than yesterday, his one good ear lifted halfway, his amber eyes moving between their faces as if following a conversation he understood by tone, if not by word. Callum lifted the puppy carefully and held him against his chest. The burn mark pressed against his palm through the thin fur. He could feel the slight ridge of damaged tissue beneath his fingers. Someone had burned this animal. Someone had tied something around its neck until it left a permanent impression. Someone had put it outside in freezing temperatures not once, but repeatedly, until its lungs filled with infection and its paws wore raw against frozen ground. And someone had registered it to a woman whose health status was listed as unstable. The questions that had begun at the clinic yesterday were no longer questions. They were the early shape of something much worse. The Soren house stood on Birchfield Lane, a quiet residential street 3 blocks from the river. It was a 2-story structure with pale siding and a roof heavy with snow, the kind of house built to hold generations. Wide porch, shuttered windows, a mailbox at the curb with the name painted in careful letters that had begun to fade. From the street, it looked like the kind of place people imagined when they spoke about family and belonging. But as Callum parked and cut the engine, something about it felt held back, as if the building itself were under instruction not to say too much. Nova stirred the moment Callum stepped out into the cold. The puppy was bundled inside Callum's jacket, warm now, but still fragile. His amber eyes opened halfway, and he lifted his head just enough to look at the house. One ear twitched. His body stiffened for a moment against Callum's ribs. Then he pressed closer, burrowing deeper into the jacket. "Easy," Callum murmured. The door opened before he reached it. Hilda Soren stood in the doorway. She was small and slight, wrapped in a light gray wool coat a size too large for her narrow shoulders. Her posture carried the memory of someone who once stood straighter, but had learned over time to fold inward to take up less space to become easier to overlook. Her hair was silver and pinned back into a neat bun, a few strands loose at her temples. Her skin was pale and thin, nearly translucent in the winter light, and her eyes washed blue with age widened the instant they fell on the bundle in Callum's arms. "Oh," she breathed. The sound broke into a sob before she could catch it. "Oh, my boy." Nova tensed, then wriggled. His head lifted higher, nose working furiously. A thin, broken sound came from his throat. Not fear, not pain. Recognition. Hilda reached out with trembling hands, stopping just short of touching him as if afraid he might vanish. "That is him," she whispered. Tears ran freely down the lines of her face. "That is Nova. I knew he would come back. I knew it." Callum lowered the puppy so she could see his face. Nova leaned forward, sniffed her fingers, and licked them once, slow and deliberate. The old woman's knees buckled. Callum steadied her with his free hand and guided her back inside. The warmth of the house was different from his own. Thicker, heavier, layered with the smells of old furniture, cleaning products, and something medicinal underneath. The living room was neat to the point of stiffness, every surface polished, every object placed with intention. Yet nothing felt lived in. Framed photographs lined the walls, but several on the mantel had been turned face down their backs, staring out instead of faces. Callum noticed. He said nothing. "Mom." A voice called from the hallway. Garnett Soren appeared. Early 40s, tall but soft around the middle. Dark hair combed neatly back. Clean-shaven face arranged into an expression of polite concern that arrived half a second after his eyes had already calculated the situation and found it inconvenient. He wore a black puffer jacket over a gray turtleneck, the kind of outfit assembled to project responsibility and order. "Well," he said, a practiced smile. "Looks like you found him." Behind him came Jolene, slimmer, quicker in her movements, dark hair pulled back with a precise clip, camel-colored wool coat, black scarf looped just so. Her face was sharp in an elegant way. Her smile practiced her eyes reading the room the way a dealer reads a table. "Oh, Mom," she said gently, stepping forward, hands lifting in concern. "You should not get so worked up." Hilda clutched Nova closer. The puppy nestled against her chest, and she stroked his head with fingers that would not stop shaking. "They left him outside," she said, her voice cracked. I told you they left him out too long." Garnett sighed. The sound was rehearsed, polished smooth by repetition. "He gets out, Mom. You know that. He has always been curious. We cannot watch him every second." Callum said nothing. He watched. Nova, who had relaxed at Hilda's touch, stiffened the moment Garnett stepped closer. His ears flattened. He did not growl, did not bark. He simply shifted, inching his body away until he was pressed against Callum's leg instead of Hilda's arm. Callum noticed. Jolene noticed too. Her smile flickered like a bulb with a loose connection. "Thank you for bringing him back," Jolene said, turning her full attention to Callum. Warm, grateful, controlled. "It was kind of you. We were just distracted with everything going on. He was found under a bench in the park." Callum said evenly. Temperature was below -5. Garnett's jaw tightened by a fraction. That park is not far. He could have wandered. 2 months old, Callum replied. The words landed in the room like stones dropped into still water. Silence. Hilda was guided to the couch. Callum sat beside her Nova between them, the puppy's breathing still uneven but calmer in her presence. As Hilda fussed over Nova, Callum's eyes moved through the room. On a side table, pill bottles sat in a tidy row, labels facing outward. He recognized enough of the names to know the spacing was wrong. Too many for one day, too few for another. One bottle had a pharmacy label dated 3 weeks ago. The one beside it was dated 5 months ago and still appeared nearly full. Either the medication was not being taken, or it was being given on a schedule that had nothing to do with what was prescribed. Nearby desk drawers were locked with a small brass mechanism. The key was not on the desk, not on the shelf, not anywhere visible. The photographs on the mantel he saw now were not turned randomly. The ones face down showed Hilda Younger standing beside a man who must have been her husband, laughing in a garden holding a glass of wine at what looked like an anniversary dinner, her posture straight, her expression vivid and unafraid. The photos left visible showed only Garnett and Jolene, recent, composed, smiling into a camera with the practiced ease of people who understood the importance of documentation. I need some air, Callum said after a few minutes. He rose and stepped into the backyard through the kitchen door. The yard was blanketed in snow. A narrow path led toward a small shed. Nova squirmed in his arms, more alert now than he had been all day. He stretched his neck, sniffing hard, then wriggled until Callum set him down. The puppy stumbled through the snow, recovered, and began pawing at a spot near the fence. Not digging hard, just scratching, whining softly, refusing to move. Callum knelt and brushed the snow aside with his gloved hands. Beneath it, dark against the frozen earth, lay something familiar. His fingers closed around it. A collar, frayed fabric, snapped clean through, not torn by pulling, cut. Nova pressed his nose to it and let out a small broken sound that needed no translation. Callum stared at the collar. Cold settled deeper than the weather could account for. He straightened, slowly scanning the yard, the fence, the quiet house behind him. Inside, Jolene's voice drifted through the glass, light, dismissive, laughing at something no one in the yard found funny. He slipped the broken collar into his pocket and scooped Nova back up. The puppy did not resist. He rested his head against Callum's chest, eyes open, watchful. When Callum returned inside, Hilda was calmer but still trembling. Garnett stood by the window, arms crossed. Jolene sat in a chair, her smile absent now. He needs rest, Callum said, handing Nova back to Hilda gently. And supervision, vet's orders. Garnett nodded. We will handle it. Callum left. In the truck engine running, he sat for a long moment. The broken collar lay heavy in his pocket. He thought of the bench, the shadows, the burn mark beneath Nova's fur, the pills arranged on a schedule that made no medical sense, the locked drawers with no key in sight, the photographs turned away from the room as if the woman Hilda used to be was an inconvenience to the people living in her house. He thought of the way Garnett's smile arrived, a beat too late, always preceded by a calculation always perfectly sized for the situation. The way Jolene's concern came packaged in efficiency rather than warmth. The way both of them spoke about Hilda in the third person, even when she was sitting right there, as if she were a problem to be described rather than a person to be addressed. Nova had not been lost. He had been removed. And whatever was happening inside that house on Birchfield Lane was not something that would explain itself without pressure. That evening, Callum did not run. He sat in the chair by the fire with Nova sleeping on a blanket across his lap, the puppy's breath rising and falling in a rhythm that had become over just 3 days as familiar as the ticking of the kitchen clock. The house was dark, except for the fire. Snow tapped against the windows in soft, irregular bursts. The world outside had shrunk to a narrow band of lamplight and falling white, and inside the world had shrunk to this, a man afire and a small animal that refused to let him disappear. The memory came without invitation. Lena kneeling on the kitchen floor of this very house, her dark hair falling across her face as she scrubbed at a stain that had been there when they moved in and would probably outlast them both. She wore an old flannel shirt of his that was 3 sizes too large, the sleeves rolled to her elbows, her bare feet pale against the cold tile. The radio on the counter played something he could not now remember, only that it was slow, and she had been humming along before she noticed him standing there. She looked up and caught him watching from the doorway. Her expression shifted the way water shifts when a stone drops in. From concentration to amusement, to something softer that she never tried to name and he never asked her to. "You are staring," she said. "I know. Is there a reason?" "Several." She threw the sponge at him. He caught it without looking, and she laughed the way she always laughed, full and sudden and completely without reservation, the kind of laugh that filled a room, the way sunlight fills a room, reaching into corners you did not know were dark until they were not anymore. The memory dissolved. The kitchen was empty. The stain was still there, faintly visible in the dim light from the fire. The laugh was not. It would never be again. Callum's hand tightened on the arm of the chair. His breathing had changed. Shorter, faster. The familiar compression in his chest that came before the worst of it, the feeling of the world tilting on an axis he could not see, gravity pulling him sideways toward a place he could not afford to visit. His vision narrowed. The edges of the room softened and blurred. And for a moment, the only thing in focus was the empty kitchen doorway where Lena had stood, and the only sound was the absence of her laugh, which was louder somehow than any sound the house had ever held. Nova lifted his head. The puppy's eyes opened amber, catching the firelight, and found Callum's face. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Nova shifted on the blanket, stood on unsteady legs, and stepped carefully across Callum's lap until his front paws rested against Callum's chest. He pressed his nose into the hollow of Callum's throat and stayed there, breathing in, breathing out his small body, warm and real and unshakably present. Callum closed his eyes. His hand came up to rest on Nova's back. The heartbeat beneath his palm was steady now, calm. It beat against his fingers with the patience of something that had no intention of leaving. The panic receded, not all at once, in stages, like water draining slowly from a flooded room. The images behind his eyes did not disappear, but they softened, losing their sharp edges, retreating to a distance where they could be seen without being touched. He sat there for a long time, breathing in rhythm with the dog letting the fire burn down to embers and the room grow dim. A knock broke the stillness. Callum opened his eyes. Nova's head lifted, one ear rotating toward the front door. Not alarmed, curious. Callum set the puppy down gently and crossed the room. Ruth Calloway stood on his porch. She was 68 years old, and she looked it honestly without apology or disguise. Silver hair cut short and practical, parted on the left and tucked behind ears that were pink with cold. A face lined by weather and years, and the particular kind of grief that comes from loving someone who decided not to love you back. Her eyes were brown and sharp beneath heavy lids and carried the quality of having seen enough to know when something was wrong, and not nearly enough to stop being bothered by it. She wore a heavy wool coat buttoned to the throat and held a foil-covered dish in both hands with the steadiness of someone who had been delivering food to people in trouble for longer than she could remember. "Dr. Thorne called me," Ruth said without preamble. "Told me you found Hilda Soren's dog in the park." She glanced past Callum into the house, spotted Nova by the fire, and her expression softened briefly before resetting. "I brought food. The kind you heat up, not the kind you cook. You do not look like someone who cooks." Callum stepped aside and let her in. Ruth set the dish on the kitchen counter and stood for a moment looking around the bare room with an expression that was not pity, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, perhaps. The recognition of one stripped-down life looking at another. "I knew Hilda before," Ruth said, settling into the other chair by the fire without being asked. Nova watched her from his blanket, cautious but not afraid. Before Garnett moved back, before Jolene, she was different then, sharp, opinionated. She ran the garden club for 15 years, and half the town was afraid of her in the best possible way. Ruth paused. Since they came, she has gotten smaller, quieter, like someone is turning the volume down on her a little more each month. "How long?" Callum asked. They moved in about a year and a half ago. After Hilda's husband Walter passed, Garnett said it was to help, take care of the house, manage her affairs. Ruth looked at the fire. At first it seemed right. Good son coming home to help his mother. The neighbors all said how lucky she was. And then, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Nova inched closer to her, sniffed her hand, then retreated back to Callum's boot. Then things started disappearing. Not objects, connections. Hilda stopped coming to church, stopped answering her phone, stopped showing up at the garden club she had run for a decade and a half. When you asked Garnett about it, he had an answer for everything. She is tired. She is confused lately. The doctor said she needs rest. Ruth's voice hardened slightly. Tired, I could believe. Confused, maybe. But Hilda Soren did not stop doing things because she was confused. She stopped because someone stopped letting her. Callum leaned forward. You have seen this before. I have lived long enough to know what it looks like when someone is being erased while they are still breathing, Ruth said. She met his eyes directly. My daughter stopped calling me 7 years ago. No fight, no warning, no letter explaining what I had done or what she needed me to be that I was not. Just silence. A phone that rang and never answered. A mailbox that accepted letters and never returned them. I spent 4 years blaming myself. 3 more learning that blame was not the point. The point was that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you decide that your existence is inconvenient and they find quiet, efficient ways to make you smaller until you fit inside a box they can manage or forget. She paused. Her hand rested on her knee, still and steady. What is happening to Hilda is not the same thing, but it rhymes. The fire popped. Nova flinched, then settled. She called me, Ruth said quietly. 3 months ago, late at night, crying. She said they want to take my house. They want me to sign papers. I tried to call back the next day. The number had been changed. She looked at Callum. I went to the house. Garnett met me at the door. Very polite, very concerned. He said Hilda was resting and could not have visitors. He thanked me for caring and closed the door in my face. Callum felt the broken collar shift in his pocket. He thought of the burn mark beneath Nova's fur, the pills arranged wrong on the side table, the photographs turned down. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Ruth studied him for a long moment. "Because you found her dog dying in a park in the middle of winter, and instead of dropping it at a shelter, you are sitting here at midnight with medication on your counter and that look on your face." She gestured vaguely toward him. The look of a man who has already decided to do something and is just waiting for his brain to catch up with his gut. She stood pulling her coat tighter. At the door, she paused and looked back. "Callum," she said, "I lost my daughter because I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. I will not make that mistake with Hilda." She left. The door closed softly behind her. Snow continued to fall. Nova walked across the floor on legs that were slightly steadier than yesterday, climbed onto the blanket beside Callum's chair, and lay down with his chin resting on Callum's boot. His eyes stayed open, watching the door Ruth had walked through, as if he understood that something had just shifted in the architecture of this story and was waiting to see what shape it would take next. Callum sat in the quiet house and listened to the fire die. Outside, the town slept under fresh snow doors, locked curtains drawn every house holding its own particular silence. Inside, the broken collar in his pocket pressed against his thigh like a question he could no longer avoid. 3 months ago, Hilda Soren had called a friend in the middle of the night and said they want to take my house. The next day, her phone number was changed. Her dog, the one living thing in that house that responded to her with unconditional loyalty, was put outside again and again until it nearly died. The photographs of her former life were turned face down. Her medications were rearranged. Her drawers were locked. And the son who had come home to help stood in a polished doorway with a practiced smile and answered every question before it could fully form. Callum knew what this was. He had seen it in different forms in different countries wearing different faces. Control did not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrived with concern, with helpfulness, with the slow, patient disassembly of everything that made a person recognizable to themselves until the only voice they could hear was the one telling them to rest. He looked down at Nova. The puppy looked back, amber eyes steady in the fading firelight, one ear finally beginning to hold itself upright. They were not done. They were not even close. Over the next several days, Callum returned Nova to the Soren house for short visits so Hilda could see him. Each visit followed the same pattern. Hilda would brighten the moment Nova appeared, her hands steadying her voice, gaining an authority that seemed to surprise even her. She would stroke his ears and murmur his name, and for those brief minutes, she looked like the woman Ruth had described, sharp, present, unafraid. Her posture would straighten in the armchair. Her eyes would clear. She would ask Callum questions about Nova's recovery, specific questions about appetite and breathing, and whether his ear had started to stand yet, and the questions themselves were proof of a mind that was working far better than her son wanted anyone to believe. And each visit, Nova's reactions told a story the humans in the room were still learning to read. When Garnett entered, Nova's ears went flat. He did not growl or bark. He simply repositioned himself between Hilda and whatever direction Garnett approached from his small body, angled like a shield. When Jolene spoke, particularly when she spoke for Hilda or redirected a conversation away from something Hilda had started to say, Nova would whine. A thin, insistent sound, his eyes moving between Jolene's face and Hilda's with a precision that was impossible to dismiss as random. During the second visit, Callum witnessed something that sharpened everything. Jolene entered the living room carrying a small paper cup with a pill inside. She approached Hilda with the brisk efficiency of a nurse on a schedule and held the cup out. "Time for your afternoon dose, Mom." Hilda reached for it. Nova was on his feet before her fingers closed around the cup. He placed himself squarely between Hilda and the medication, whimpering, his eyes flicking from the cup to Jolene's hand and back again. Not randomly, with the focused attention of an animal connecting two specific things and finding the connection dangerous. Callum leaned forward. "What is the dosage schedule?" he asked. Jolene's expression froze for a fraction of a second, a hairline crack in the porcelain of her composure before the smile returned. "I manage Mom's medications. The doctor set it up." "Which doctor?" Callum asked. "Her primary care physician." Jolene's voice was still warm, still patient, but her fingers had tightened around the paper cup. "It is all very routine." Hilda's hand had stopped reaching. She looked down at Nova, then at the cup, then at her own trembling fingers, and something passed across her face that was not confusion. It was doubt. The particular doubt of a person who has been told so many times that everything is fine, that they have stopped trusting their own sense that it is not. "I do not feel right today," Hilda said softly. "Not today." The cup was set aside. Jolene smiled and said, "Of course," and left the room. But the smile she wore out the door was not the smile she had worn in. On the third visit, Callum watched it happen in real time. Hilda was sitting in her armchair near the window, Nova beside her on the cushion, when Garnett appeared with a clipboard and a pen. He sat on the ottoman in front of his mother and leaned forward with the posture of someone about to explain something complicated to someone simple. "Mom, we just need you to look at these forms. It is nothing major, just the insurance paperwork I mentioned last week." Hilda reached for the clipboard. Nova stood. He placed himself directly between Hilda's hand and the papers. His body rigid, a low whimper threading from his throat. Hilda hesitated. Garnett's smile held, but the muscles around his eyes tightened. "He is excitable today," Garnett said lightly. He reached to move Nova aside. The puppy did not snap, did not bare teeth, but he leaned his full weight against Hilda's arm and refused to shift, his amber eyes locked on the clipboard with an intensity that made the air in the room feel thinner. "Not today," Hilda said quietly. She withdrew her hand. "I do not feel well enough today." Garnett held his smile for 3 more seconds before standing. "Of course, Mom, whenever you are ready." He left the room. Jolene, who had been watching from the kitchen doorway, exchanged a glance with her husband that lasted less than a second, but contained an entire conversation. Callum saw it. He filed it alongside everything else he had gathered without asking for it. The pills with their mismatched schedules. The photographs on the mantel that told 2 different stories depending on which direction they faced. He had looked more carefully at the face-down frames during this visit, angling his head while Garnett was in the kitchen. They showed Hilda standing beside her late husband Walter in a garden lush with summer. Her posture in those photographs was straight shoulders, back chin, lifted, her hand resting on Walter's arm, not for support, but for affection. She was smiling in every one of them, but it was not the careful, diminished smile she wore now. It was the smile of a woman who occupied space without apology. The photographs Garnett left visible showed only himself and Jolene. Callum understood now why the old pictures had been turned. They were evidence of who Hilda used to be, and who she used to be was a threat to the story Garnett needed the world to believe. That evening, he found the envelope. It lay half hidden beneath a stack of mail on the hallway console, its corner visible just enough to catch his eye. He waited until Garnett stepped outside for a phone call, then reached for it and read what was visible without removing it from the stack. Property Transfer Draft. Beneath the heading, a name, Hilda Soren, and a date less than 2 weeks away. He slid the envelope back exactly where he had found it, and returned to the living room where Hilda dozed with Nova curled against her hip. The next morning, Garnett escalated. Callum learned this not from Garnett directly, but from the way the town shifted around him. At the hardware store, the clerk who usually nodded looked away. At the gas station, a woman from Birchfield Lane stared through her windshield with an expression balanced between curiosity and suspicion. At the post office, a man stopped him in the parking lot. "You are the one who has been going over to Hilda Soren's place," the man said. Not hostile, not friendly, just establishing fact. "I found her dog," Callum replied. "Her son mentioned that. He also mentioned you have been visiting quite a bit. Said his mother gets confused and sometimes people take advantage." The man paused. "Just thought you should know what is being said." Garnett was building a narrative. The concerned outsider becomes the suspicious stranger. The man who rescued a dog becomes the man who will not give it back. The person asking questions becomes the person who needs to be questioned. It was efficient, it was quiet, and it was working. Ruth called that afternoon. Her voice was clipped. "Garnett came to see me this morning. Very polite. He told me the best thing I could do for Hilda was give the family space. Then he reminded me that Hilda's affairs were legally in his hands and that outside interference could complicate matters for everyone involved." "He threatened you," Callum said. "He smiled while he did it," Ruth replied. "That is the part that made my skin crawl." Elise continued documenting with quiet precision. Photographs of Nova's healing annotated with dates and measurements. Records of original injuries, the respiratory infection, the ligature marks the contact burn. Notes on stress responses in specific environments, which rooms triggered anxiety, which presences caused the puppy to position himself protectively, which voices made him go rigid and still. She kept a separate log for behavioral observations during the Soren house visits, noting times, durations, and the specific stimulus that preceded each reaction. She did not editorialize. She did not speculate. She recorded what she saw in steady handwriting, building a paper trail that would speak for itself when the time came. "Patterns matter," she said again, the second time she had used those exact words, adjusting her glasses as she reviewed the timeline she had constructed on a single long sheet of paper that now covered half her desk. "They always do." Callum understood now that she was not merely observing. She was constructing something, a case built not on accusation but on accumulation, each small fact clicking into the next like stones laid in a wall that would eventually be too high to step over. Then Garnett came for Callum directly. They met in the parking lot of the hardware store. Garnett was waiting beside Callum's truck arms folded coat, buttoned his posture, relaxed his expression warm. Everything about him projected reasonableness, approaching a reasonable conversation. "Callum," he said, "I want to be honest with you. My mother's situation is complicated. Her health, her finances, the house. Jolene and I moved back specifically to manage all of it. We gave up our lives to be here." He paused, letting sacrifice settle into the air. "You are a good man, but your involvement is making things harder. Mom gets attached. She gets confused about who is family and who is a visitor. She was not confused when I found her dog dying in the park," Callum said. Garnett's smile held. "Animals wander. Gates fail. Things happen." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I spoke with the sheriff this morning. Just a courtesy call. He may want to chat with you about the dog to make sure everything is documented properly." The words were polite. The message was not. Back off, or what comes next will cost you more than a rescued puppy is worth. Callum held Garnett's gaze for a long moment. He did not argue. He did not defend. He simply looked at the man with the stillness that 14 years of operating in places where a wrong word could end a life had built into the architecture of his face. Then he got in the truck and drove away. Nova sat in the passenger seat, ears flat, body pressed against the far door, as far from Garnett as he could get. The sheriff came the next morning. Broad-shouldered, graying beard, tired eyes that suggested he had been doing this job long enough to recognize the difference between a genuine complaint and a political one, but not long enough to stop responding to both with the same procedural thoroughness. He stood on Callum's porch and asked about the dog without accusation, but without warmth. Where Callum had found it. Why he had not returned it immediately. Was he aware the animal was registered to someone else? Whether he had any prior relationship with the Soren family? Callum answered each question directly, his voice, even his posture open. He showed the veterinary records. He explained the medical hold. The sheriff nodded, noted something in a small book, and left without offering an opinion in either direction. It was not an arrest, but it was a signal. Garnett's machinery was turning. That evening, Callum stood outside the Soren house with Nova in his arms and considered the simplest option. Return the dog. Walk away. Let the system handle what came next. He had no legal standing, no family connection, no authority beyond the fact that he had found a dying animal and had not been able to stop pulling the thread since. He was a man alone in a town that was beginning to look at him sideways, holding a puppy that legally belonged to someone else, carrying a broken collar in his pocket, and a collection of observations that any reasonable person could dismiss as the overreach of a stranger who had gotten too involved. He thought of Lena. Not the accident, not the metal or the lights. He thought of the way she would have looked at him right now, standing in the snow with doubt on his face and a sick dog in his arms. She would not have hesitated. She would have walked up those steps and knocked on that door and said exactly what needed to be said, because Lena had never in her life confused caution with conscience. And the thought of her certainty, her absolute refusal to look away from something that was wrong, made the doubt in his chest feel like cowardice wearing a reasonable mask. He looked at the front door. The porch light was on. Inside, the faint shape of Hilda sat in her armchair by the window alone, small, wrapped in her gray coat, even indoors. He stepped toward the door. Nova reacted instantly. The puppy clamped his teeth onto Callum's sleeve and pulled, not playfully, desperately. His body twisted away from the house, all four legs bracing against Callum's chest, a high, frantic whine streaming from his throat. Callum stopped. Nova pulled harder, the sound rising, his amber eyes wide, with something that looked nothing like animal instinct, and everything like a plea. Callum did not move toward the door again. He followed the pull. Nova led him around the side of the house through the gate into the backyard. The snow was thick and undisturbed except for the narrow path to the shed. Nova squirmed until Callum set him down, and the puppy immediately began to dig. Not at the fence where he had found the collar days ago. A different place. Closer to the foundation beneath the window of Hilda's bedroom. He dug with a focus that bordered on frenzy snow flying behind him, front paws scraping through frozen crust until they hit something solid. Callum knelt and brushed the remaining snow aside. His fingers closed around the edge of a small metal box, scratched and dented, sealed with a simple clasp that opened with a click. Inside, protected by a plastic bag folded carefully around them, were papers. A photocopy of a property deed, a life insurance document, a bank statement with entries circled in shaking ink, and beneath them, a single sheet of lined paper covered in handwriting that trembled at the beginning of each line and steadied toward the end as if the person writing had to fight for control of her own hand with every sentence. Callum read it by the light of his phone, snow falling on the screen. His breath fogged the words, and he wiped the screen with his thumb, leaning closer, reading with the concentration of a man defusing something that could go off at any moment. I am writing this because I do not know who will find it or when. My name is Hilda Soren. I am of sound mind. I want that written here because my son tells people I am not, and I am afraid that soon I will start to believe him. They want the house. They want the accounts. They have had me sign papers I did not understand and told me it was for my own protection. When I refused to sign more, things changed. My phone was taken. My friends were told I was too ill for visitors. My medication was reorganized in ways I cannot follow. The locks on my desk were changed. They took Nova from me because he was the only one who reacted when things felt wrong. He would stand between me and the papers. He would cry when Jolene changed my pills. He knew. Animals know. And they could not have that. If you are reading this, please help me. I am not confused. I am afraid. Callum read the letter twice, then a third time slower. His jaw tightening with each pass, letting each sentence settle into the picture he had been assembling since the night he found a dying puppy under a bench in the snow. The handwriting alone was testimony. It was not the scrawl of a confused mind. It was the writing of a frightened woman fighting to keep her hands steady long enough to leave proof that she still existed as a person with thoughts and rights and a voice that deserved to be heard. Nova sat beside him, pressed against his knee, breathing steadily, amber eyes watching Callum's face with the patience of a creature who had done his part and was waiting for the human to do his. Hilda Soren was not confused. She was not declining. She was not a woman whose mind had softened with age and who needed her son to manage her life. She was a woman under siege. Methodical, patient, quiet siege. Her home taken. Her connections severed. Her medication controlled. Her voice dismissed. And her dog, the one small creature that consistently reacted to what was happening. The one witness that could not be reasoned with or manipulated or told to rest, had been removed and left to die in a frozen park on the coldest night of the year. The puppy was not a casualty. He was a target. And Hilda, knowing this, knowing she might not be believed, knowing her own son would smile and explain her away, had buried her testimony in the ground like a woman hiding a message during a war. She had prepared for the possibility that no one would come. But she had also prepared for the possibility that someone would. Callum stood. Snow covered his shoulders and Nova's head. The house was quiet behind him, windows dark except for the single lamp in Hilda's room. Somewhere inside, Garnett and Jolene sat in the warmth they had appropriated, confident the walls they had built around the old woman would hold. They did not know about the box. They did not know that a dying puppy had led a stranger to the one piece of evidence that could not be explained away with a smile and a handshake. Callum walked to the truck. He placed Nova on the seat, started the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel, the metal box pressing against his chest beneath the jacket, the letter inside it pressing against everything he had believed about his own ability to remain uninvolved. He had spent 2 years building walls, clearing rooms, emptying shelves, removing every trace of attachment from his life, because attachment meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant loss. And loss was the only thing left in the world that could still bring him to his knees. And now, a 70-year-old woman he barely knew had buried a letter in the frozen ground because she had no one else to ask. And a 2-month-old dog had led him straight to it, and the walls he had built were not coming down so much as they were becoming irrelevant. There were things on the other side of those walls that mattered more than the safety they provided. He made 2 calls. The first to Elise. "I need you to pull together every record you have on Nova. Everything from day one." "It is already done," Elise said. "I have been waiting for you to ask." The second to Ruth. "I found something at the house, something Hilda buried." Silence. Then Ruth's voice, quiet and steady and carrying the weight of a woman who had spent 7 years learning what it costs to stay silent. "Tell me where to be," she said. "And when." Callum looked at Nova. The puppy looked back, both ears lifted now, for the first time standing upright and alert and absolutely certain. "Tomorrow," Callum said. "We do not have much time." Outside, snow continued to fall over the Soren house, covering the yard, the place where Nova had dug the window of the room where Hilda sat alone. By morning, the ground would show no trace of what had been unearthed, but what had been found could not be buried again. The truth had been pulled from the frozen earth by a creature too small and too sick to have any business saving anyone. And yet, here they were. They met at Callum's house the following morning, the 3 of them arranged around the kitchen table like a small war council that had not yet learned to call itself one. Ruth arrived first before the sun had fully cleared the tree line, carrying a thermos of coffee and the expression of a woman who had not slept and did not intend to apologize for it. Elise came 20 minutes later with a canvas bag over her shoulder that contained a folder thick enough to make the zipper strain. Nova lay on his blanket near the hearth, watching the door each time it opened his ears, lifting and settling as he catalogued each new presence. When Ruth entered, he sniffed her hand and returned to his blanket. When Elise entered, he stood, walked to her, pressed his nose against her palm, and stayed there until she crouched and scratched behind his ears. It was the first time Callum had seen Nova seek contact with anyone other than himself or Hilda. Elise noticed. She smiled briefly, the kind of smile that appears and disappears before it can be mistaken for softness. Callum set the metal box on the table and opened it. He laid out the contents one piece at a time. The property deed, the insurance documents, the bank statements with their circled entries, and finally, the letter which he unfolded carefully and placed in the center of the table, where the light from the window fell directly across Hilda's shaking handwriting. Ruth read it first. She picked it up with both hands and held it close, her lips moving slightly as she followed each line. When she reached the end, she set it down and pressed her fingertips against the table as if steadying herself against something only she could feel. "That is Hilda," she said. Her voice was thick but controlled. "That is exactly how she writes, how she thinks. Every sentence precise and stubborn." She looked up. "This is not a confused woman. This is a woman who knew exactly what was happening to her and had no one left to tell." Elise opened her folder and began laying out her own materials beside the box. Photographs of Nova from the first examination ribs, visible fur matted the ligature mark on his neck, vivid against pale skin. Photographs from subsequent visits showing the burn mark on his left side, the worn paw pads, the gradual improvement under proper care. A typed timeline that began with the night Callum found Nova and extended through every visit to the Soren house, each entry annotated with observed behaviors, stress responses, and environmental triggers. The medical evidence supports a pattern of repeated neglect and deliberate harm over a period of at least several weeks, Elise said. She spoke the way she always spoke, with the measured precision of someone who understood that facts presented calmly are harder to dismiss than facts delivered with emotion. The respiratory infection alone indicates prolonged exposure to cold and damp conditions. The contact burn is consistent with intentional injury. The ligature marks suggest restraint. None of these are accidental. None of them happened once. She placed one final document on the table, a behavioral analysis she had compiled from her observation notes charting Nova's reactions to specific individuals in specific situations. It showed in clinical language, stripped of opinion, that the puppy exhibited consistent protective behavior toward Hildy and consistent avoidance of Garnett and Jolene, with stress responses that intensified in the presence of specific objects, including paperwork, medication, and the clipboard Garnett used. A defense attorney could argue that an animal's behavior is not evidence, Elise said. But combined with the physical injuries, the letter, and the property transfer documents, it becomes part of a pattern that is very difficult to explain away. Ruth leaned forward. "What do we do with this?" Callum had been standing by the window looking out at the snow-covered street where nothing moved except the slow drift of flakes against the glass. He turned back to the table. "We report it," he said. "Adult Protective Services, the sheriff. Everything goes through official channels. Elise's records, the box, Ruth's testimony about the phone call 3 months ago. All of it. And if Garnett has already laid the groundwork to discredit us," Ruth asked, "he has spent the last week telling everyone in town that you are an obsessive stranger and I am a meddling neighbor. By the time we walk into any office, the story is already set." "Then the evidence has to be louder than the story," Callum said. He picked up the letter and read the last line again. "If you are reading this, please help me. I am not confused. I am afraid." "She buried this, knowing it might never be found," he said quietly. "She buried it because she had no other option. We are the option she did not know she had." The call to Adult Protective Services was made that morning. Callum spoke clearly, provided names, dates, and a summary of the evidence. The intake worker asked standard questions, took notes, and said an investigation would be opened. The process, she explained, would take time. Garnett would be contacted. Hilda would be interviewed. There were protocols. Callum thanked her and hung up. He looked at Ruth and Elise across the table. All three of them knew what protocols meant. It meant Garnett would be warned. It meant Hilda would be coached. It meant the evidence in the metal box would face the full weight of a son's practiced sincerity and a system that moved slowly by design. They had started the clock. Now they had to hope the clock did not run out before the wheels turned. The rest of the day passed with the particular tension of people waiting for something they cannot control. Ruth stayed through the morning, sitting in the chair by the fire that had become hers without anyone assigning it. She drank her coffee slowly and watched Callum the way she watched most things, with the patient attention of someone who had learned that the most important information usually arrives after the conversation appears to be over. "You are afraid," she said, not as an accusation. Callum, who was standing at the window with his back to her, did not turn around. Of what? Of staying. Of being the person who stays and then loses again. She set her mug down. "I recognize it because I lived it for 7 years after my daughter left. I kept everyone at arm's length because if no one got close enough to matter, no one could leave in a way that destroyed me. And I was right. No one got close. No one left. And I was the loneliest person I had ever met." Callum turned. Ruth held his gaze without flinching. "You cannot save Lena," she said quietly, but without softness. "That is done. But this is not done. Hilda is still alive, and that dog knows it, even if you are still trying to decide whether it is safe to care." The words landed the way truth lands when it arrives without padding. Hard, clean, impossible to set aside. Callum took Nova for a short walk along the edge of town, the puppy's steps growing steadier each day, his one stubborn ear now holding itself upright for minutes at a time before folding back down as if the effort required a rest. They walked in silence, man and dog, breath fogging in twin clouds, boots and paws printing parallel tracks in the fresh snow. When they returned, Callum stood in the doorway and looked at the repaired collar he had hung on a nail by the door. The break was still visible, the frayed edges pressed back together, but not hidden. He touched it once briefly, the way a person touches a talisman they are not sure they believe in, but are unwilling to let go of. Then night came, and with it, the storm. It began as a thickening of the air, a heaviness that pressed down on the town like a hand laid flat over a candle flame. By late afternoon, the sky had darkened to the color of iron, and by dusk, the snow was falling in thick, deliberate sheets that erased the boundary between ground and sky. Wind arrived behind the snow, not the sharp, cutting wind of previous nights, but something deeper, a sustained roar that rattled windows in their frames and turned the streets into white tunnels where visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Callum noticed the change in Nova long before his phone rang. The puppy had been restless since late afternoon. He paced in tight, uneven circles near the front door, ears twitching at sounds Callum could not hear, body tightening each time the wind pressed against the walls. His breathing, which had improved steadily over the past week, came faster now, not from illness, but from agitation. A thin whine threaded through the quiet of the house, rising and falling, but never stopping entirely. When Callum knelt and rested a hand on his back, Nova did not settle. He pressed into the touch for a moment, then pulled away, and resumed pacing, his amber eyes returning again and again to the door. Something was wrong. Something Nova could feel that had not yet reached Callum through the ordinary channels of sight and sound. The phone rang at 8:14. Garnett's voice was calm, controlled, almost casual, the way a person sounds when they have rehearsed what they are about to say and are satisfied with the delivery. "Mom stepped out for some air," he said. "She does that sometimes, likes to walk by the river, but it is getting late and the weather is turning, so I thought I should let you know." Callum looked at Nova. The puppy had frozen the instant the phone rang. His head was lifted eyes wide and fixed on the door, every muscle in his small body locked with an alertness that made the air in the room feel electric. "Where exactly did she go?" Callum asked, a pause, calibrated. "Probably the park. She is always like the water. I would not worry. She will be back." The line went dead. Nova let out a sharp, broken sound that was half bark and half scream, and lunged for Callum's pant leg teeth, catching fabric, pulling hard toward the door, with a strength that seemed impossible for an animal his size and condition. His eyes were wild, not with fear, with certainty, with the absolute, unshakable knowledge of a creature who has been in this exact situation before and knows what is at stake. Callum did not hesitate. He grabbed his jacket, scooped Nova up, and was out the door in seconds. The cold hit him like a wall. Snow drove sideways across the porch, and the wind tore the door from his hand and slammed it shut behind him. He ran for the truck with Nova clutched against his chest, the puppy's heart hammering so hard Callum could feel it through both layers of fabric between them. The drive to the park took 4 minutes. It should have taken 2, but the roads were disappearing under the storm, the headlights cutting a narrow tunnel through white chaos that closed behind them as fast as they drove through it. The truck fishtailed once at the turn onto River Road, the rear end swinging wide tires, searching for grip on a surface that had stopped being a road and become something closer to a frozen river wearing asphalt as a disguise. Callum corrected without thought, his hands steady on the wheel. His breathing controlled the old training taking over the way it always did when the margin between action and disaster compressed to nothing. Beside him, Nova stood rigid on the passenger seat, front paws braced against the dashboard, his nose pressed to the glass, his breath leaving small circles of fog that appeared and vanished in rapid succession. He left the truck near the park entrance with the engine running and the headlights aimed down the main path. Then he ran. The park was unrecognizable, every landmark erased, the benches buried. The lamps reduced to faint amber smears in the white. The river was invisible, its presence announced only by the absence of trees on one side and the faint sound of water moving beneath ice that the wind carried and distorted until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Nova squirmed in his arms. Callum set him down, and the puppy hit the ground already moving. He did not wander. Did not hesitate. He chose a direction the darker stretch near the water where the path curved toward the old oak and committed to it with a focus that left no room for doubt. When Callum drifted off course, Nova stopped and whined sharply until he corrected. When the wind pushed them sideways, Nova leaned into it and kept going, his small body low to the ground, paws slipping on ice and finding purchase on snow driven by something that transcended training or instinct and entered the territory of knowledge. He knew where she was. He had always known. They reached the riverbank. The wind was sharper here, cutting through clothing and skin to the bone beneath. Callum scanned the white. Nothing. Nothing. Then, the bench. The same bench beneath the same bare oak where Callum had found Nova 10 days ago. A shape on the ground beside it, half buried in drifting snow, motionless, except for the slow, almost imperceptible movement of fabric, stirred by wind rather than breath. Hilda. She lay on her side coat, open, one arm stretched toward the river, as if she had tried to steady herself and missed. Her silver hair was dusted white. Her face was pale against the dark fabric of her coat, her lips carrying the faint blue tint that Callum recognized from training as the body's surrender flag, the color that means the core temperature has dropped past the point where shivering can save you. He was at her side in seconds, knees in snow, hands moving to her neck, finding the pulse point beneath cold skin. It was there, weak and slow and irregular, but present, alive, still here. Nova scrambled forward, slipping, catching himself, and pressed his body against Hilda's chest. He barked. Short, sharp bursts that cut through the storm like signal flares. Then he stopped barking and simply lay against her. His warmth offered without reservation, his small frame positioned as if he intended to hold her to the earth by the sheer force of his presence. Callum stripped off his jacket and wrapped it around Hilda, pulling her close, shielding her from the wind with his own body. The cold hit his exposed torso with the force of a physical blow, but he had trained for decades in conditions designed to test exactly this, the body's ability to function when comfort was no longer available as a concept. "Stay with me," he said. His voice was steady. "You are not alone. Stay with me." Hilda's eyes fluttered, opened halfway. Confusion and relief tangled in them at the same time. "Nova," she whispered. Her fingers moved against the fur pressed to her chest. "He is here," Callum said. "We are both here." Nova suddenly broke away from Hilda and spun toward the path, barking louder, now his body vibrating with effort. He charged across the snow toward a dark shape 30 yards away that Callum had not registered until this moment. A car, parked just beyond the lamp's engine cold windows, dark, half buried in drifting snow. The puppy threw himself at the rear bumper, then the trunk, barking relentlessly, his paws striking metal with a desperation that was impossible to ignore. Callum hesitated for 1 second. One. Then he left Hilda sheltered by the bench, wrapped in his jacket, Nova's warmth still radiating against her chest, and crossed the distance to the car in a dead sprint. He yanked the trunk open. Inside, piled among folded blankets and loose papers, were pill bottles. More than a dozen. Far more than any elderly woman would carry on an evening walk. Beside them, a manila folder thick with documents. Callum pulled the top page into the beam of his phone light. Hilda's name, stamped with dates, bearing signatures he recognized from the property transfer draft. His stomach dropped. This was not an evening walk. This was not a confused woman wandering into a storm. This was preparation. This was a car packed with evidence that was meant to be found after Hilda was not. A story already written in which a declining mother wandered into a blizzard with her medications and her confusion, and the cold did what the cold does, and afterward the paperwork would be sorted and the house would change hands, and the questions that might have been asked would be answered by the simple, unassailable narrative of tragedy. He slammed the trunk and sprinted back to Hilda, the contents of that carefully packed space burning in his mind like a photograph taken in a flash. His phone was already in his hand, dialing emergency services. His voice clipped and precise as he relayed location and condition and the fact that there was a vehicle involved that needed to be secured, and its contents documented before the snow buried everything. Headlights appeared at the park entrance as he finished the call. A car pulling in slowly, carefully, the way someone drives when they are arriving at a scene they expect to find empty. Garnett's car. It stopped 20 yards away. The door opened. Garnett stepped out his black puffer jacket, spotless, despite the storm, his face already arranged into concern. Jolene emerged from the passenger side, scarf pulled high against the wind, her eyes scanning the scene. "Oh, thank God," Garnett said, walking forward with his arms spread in the posture of relief. "Is she all right? We were so worried." Then he saw the trunk. Open, contents visible. The pill bottles catching the faint light from the lamps. His face changed. Not dramatically. Not the way faces change in movies with wide eyes and dropped jaws. It changed the way a wall changes when a crack appears. The structure holds the surface, remains intact, but something fundamental in the foundation has shifted, and everyone present can see that what was solid a moment ago will not be solid for much longer. Jolene's hand found Garnett's arm. Her fingers closed around the fabric of his sleeve and held on. Sirens cut through the storm before either of them spoke again. The ambulance arrived first, followed by a patrol car, their lights painting the snow in alternating red and blue that turned the park into something from a fever dream. Paramedics moved quickly to Hilda. A woman with dark hair tucked under her hat knelt beside her hands, sure and fast assessing vitals. "Hypothermia," she said. "Moderate. We got her in time." Callum let out a breath he'd been holding since the moment he saw the shape on the ground. An officer approached him, broad-shouldered, beard rimed with ice, eyes sharp but not unkind. "You the one who called it in?" Callum nodded. Nova pressed against his leg alert, watching the stretcher being loaded. "That vehicle is connected," Callum said simply. "Check the trunk." The officer's expression shifted. He signaled his partner. Moments later, voices rose behind them, urgent and controlled. More lights. More uniforms. The carefully prepared scene that Garnett had constructed was being disassembled piece by piece by people whose job it was to notice exactly the kinds of things that were not supposed to be noticed. Hilda was loaded into the ambulance. Nova watched the doors until they closed, his body rigid, his amber eyes unblinking. Callum placed a hand on the puppy's back and felt the tremor ease at last, slowly, like a wire being loosened one turn at a time. Garnett stood near his car, flanked now by officers who were no longer asking if his mother was all right. Jolene stood beside him, her composure cracking along lines that had been invisible 5 minutes ago. Her hand still gripping his sleeve, but no longer with the confidence of a partner, with the grip of someone holding on to the last solid thing in a room where the floor has started to give way. Snow continued to fall. The ambulance pulled away, its siren fading into the white. The park, the bench, the old oak, the river beneath its armor of ice. All of it stood as silent witness to what had almost happened and what had been stopped by a man who should have kept running and a dog who refused to let him. Callum stood in the falling snow, Nova pressed warm against his shin, and watched the red lights disappear. "Good boy," he said. The words were quiet, almost lost in the wind. Nova's tail moved once, a single arc. Then he sat both ears upright and waited for whatever came next, with the patience of someone who had already decided that whatever it was, he would face it beside the man who had knelt in the snow 10 days ago and said easy and meant it. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and warm blankets, a clean, controlled space that stood in quiet opposition to the night that had nearly ended everything. Hilda Soren lay propped against white pillows, her silver hair brushed back by a nurse who spoke to her with the kind of deliberate gentleness reserved for people who have been through something that cannot be undone, but can, with care, be survived. Tubes and monitors traced her breath and heartbeat with soft efficiency. She looked smaller here, diminished by the machinery and the fluorescent light. But her eyes were different. They held a clarity that Callum had not seen before, as if the cold had burned away a fog she had been living inside for months, and left behind something sharp and awake and unwilling to go back to sleep. Nova lay at the foot of her bed. A volunteer had tried to explain that animals were not permitted in patient rooms, and a nurse had overruled her with a look that required no words. The puppy was clean now, his black and tan coat brushed both ears, standing upright for the first time since Callum had found him under the bench. He lay with his chin on his paws, and each time Hilda shifted or made a sound, his head lifted immediately, amber eyes locking onto her face, ears adjusting to register every change. Dr. Elise Thorne stood near the window with her canvas bag and the folder that had grown thick enough over the past 2 weeks to require a rubber band to hold it closed. She wore a dark green sweater beneath her coat, her brown hair pulled into its usual practical knot. She reviewed the final pages of her documentation without expression, made a small note in the margin of the behavioral timeline, and then closed the folder and looked at Callum. She gave a single nod. Everything she had seen, recorded, measured, and photographed would stand on its own. It did not need embellishment. It did not need advocacy. It needed only to be placed in front of people willing to look at it, and the facts would do what facts do when they are assembled with patience and precision. They would speak. By afternoon, the town knew. Word traveled the way it always travels in small communities, not through announcements, but through the quiet accumulation of conversations held in kitchens and parking lots and over phone lines that had been still for too long. A community meeting was called at the Municipal Hall, a squat brick building near the center of town that hosted everything from bake sales to zoning disputes, and had never in anyone's memory been filled to capacity on a weekday afternoon. It was full today. Folding chairs covered the floor, their metal legs scraping softly as neighbors arrived, coats draped over arms, voices low and cautious. The air held the particular tension of a room full of people who suspect they have been living next to something terrible and are not yet sure how to feel about the fact that they did not notice sooner. A long table stood at the front where officials had gathered. A social worker with lines around her eyes that suggested she had been doing this work for longer than she had planned. A representative from Adult Protective Services who sat very straight and took notes before anyone began speaking. A local attorney whose reputation rested on thoroughness rather than aggression. And the sheriff who sat at the end of the table with the metal box from Hilda's yard, placed in front of him beside a clear evidence bag containing a frayed collar snapped clean through. Callum arrived early. Nova walked beside him, no longer carried, no longer trembling. The puppy stayed close, brushing Callum's leg with each step, his gait still carrying the earnest clumsiness of youth, but steadier now, more certain. Callum wore his usual camouflage top and trousers boots cleaned but worn tactical belt in place. He did not look like someone preparing to speak. He looked like someone prepared to stand where he was needed and stay there until the work was done. Ruth arrived shortly after wearing a wool coat she had owned for 20 years and an expression that combined determination with the particular grief of a woman who understood exactly what Hilda had endured, because she had survived her own version of being made invisible by someone who should have loved her enough to see her. Hilda was brought in, last supported by a nurse. She wore a simple cardigan over a hospital-issued shirt, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but present. When she saw Callum and Nova, her shoulders eased. Something in the rigid architecture of her posture softened not into weakness, but into relief. The relief of a person who has been alone inside a burning house and has finally heard footsteps on the stairs. Nova moved to her side immediately and sat, his body angled protectively, his eyes scanning the room once before settling. He did not need to be told where to be. He knew. Garnett and Jolene entered together. Garnett wore a charcoal coat with the scarf arranged neatly, his face composed into an expression of concerned bewilderment that he had clearly spent the morning assembling. Jolene walked half a step behind her posture, still elegant, her lips pressed into a sympathetic line, her eyes reading the room the way they always read rooms, calculating distance and angle, and the cost of every possible outcome. They nodded to neighbors. They accepted murmured words with the humble gratitude of people who wanted very much to be seen as victims of a misunderstanding rather than architects of a plan. The social worker opened the proceedings without ceremony. "This is a preliminary community review," she said. Her gaze moved from Hilda to Garnett to Callum. "We are here to establish facts, ensure safety, and determine next steps." Elise was called first. She stood and spoke plainly, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had spent her career letting evidence do the work that emotion could not. She described Nova's condition on the first morning. The respiratory infection built over weeks of repeated exposure. The ligature marks on his neck. The contact burn on his left side, older than the other injuries by at least a month. The worn paw pads. The behavioral patterns she had documented across multiple visits to the Soren house presented not as interpretation but as data points on a timeline that stretched from the night Callum found Nova to the night Hilda was found beside the same bench. She did not accuse. She did not speculate. She placed her folder on the table, opened it, and let the photographs and charts and clinical notes arrange themselves into a narrative that required no narrator. Callum followed. He stood when asked, hands resting at his sides. He described finding Nova in the park. The broken collar buried in the Soren yard. The puppy's consistent reactions inside the house, positioning himself between Hilda and paperwork, whining when medication was offered, pressing against Callum's leg whenever Garnett's voice entered the room. He described the night at the river, the car with its trunk full of pills and documents, the timing of Garnett's phone call and the calm in his voice when he reported that his mother had gone for a walk in a blizzard. He produced the metal box. He placed the letter on the table where everyone in the front row could see Hilda's handwriting trembling at the start of each line, steadying toward the end. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He reported what he had seen and found, and been led to by a puppy who should not have survived the first night, but did, and who had spent every day since then trying to show the humans around him what they had been too comfortable to notice on their own. Ruth spoke next. She told the room about the phone call 3 months ago, Hilda crying, the words, "They want to take my house," the changed phone number, the closed door. She told them about the garden club Hilda had run for 15 years, and the church she had attended every Sunday for 3 decades, and the gradual systematic disappearance of a woman from every space she had once occupied, replaced by a son's reassuring explanation and a daughter-in-law's efficient smile. "I knew something was wrong," Ruth said. Her voice did not waver. "I knew it the way you know weather is turning before the clouds arrive, and I did not push hard enough. I let a closed door stop me." She paused. "I will not let that happen again." Then it was Garnett's turn. He spoke with the practiced sincerity that had served him well for 18 months. "We never meant harm," he said. "My mother's health has been declining. We moved back to help. Managing her care, the house, her finances, it is overwhelming. Sometimes difficult decisions are misunderstood by people who do not have the full picture." He paused and let his eyes grow damp in the way that eyes grow damp when the person behind them has rehearsed the moment. We love our mother. Everything we have done has been for her." Jolene nodded along her own eyes, glistening on cue, her hand resting on Garnett's arm in the posture of solidarity. The social worker turned to Hilda. "Mrs. Soren," she said gently, "would you like to speak?" Hilda sat still for a moment. Nova pressed closer to her knee, his warmth against her leg, his steady breathing, his absolute unwavering presence beside her, the same presence that had been removed from her life so that she would have no witness, no comfort, no small living thing to remind her that she was real, and that what she felt was not confusion, but the clear-eyed recognition of someone being slowly taken apart. She spoke. Her voice trembled at the beginning, the way her handwriting trembled at the start of each line in the letter she had buried in frozen ground. But it steadied as she went, gaining the authority that Ruth and Callum and Nova had seen in her during the brief visits, the authority of a woman who had been told so many times that she was confused, that she had almost believed it, but not quite, and that not quite had saved her life. She told them about the signed papers she did not understand, the phone that was taken, the friends who were told she was too ill for company, the pills that appeared on schedules she did not recognize administered by hands that patted her shoulder afterward and told her she would feel better soon. She told them about Nova, the small creature who planted himself between her and the things that frightened her, who cried when something was wrong, who was taken from her precisely because he would not stop telling the truth in the only language he had. "They told me I was tired," Hilda said. "They told me I was confused. They told me so many times that I started to wonder if they were right." Her hands shook in her lap, but her voice held. "Nova never told me I was confused. He just stayed." The room was very quiet. Callum, who had been standing near the back, stepped forward only once. "She does not need a manager," he said. His voice carried without effort the way it had always carried in rooms where the stakes were too high for volume. "She needs to be listened to." Nova chose that exact moment to lift his head and place one paw gently over Hilda's hand where it rested on her knee. The gesture was simple, instinctive, a small weight laid down with the precision of something that understood timing in a way that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with the bond between two creatures who had found each other in the dark and refused to let go. Every eye in the room followed that paw. The silence lasted 5 full seconds. Then the social worker made a note. The attorney cleared his throat. The representative from Adult Protective Services leaned forward in her chair, her expression no longer neutral, her pen no longer still. Questions came, measured, specific, unavoidable. Why was the car prepared? Why were the documents ready? Why was Hilda outside alone in the worst storm of the season? How was it that her son called to report her missing with a calm that suggested he already knew she would not be coming back? Garnett answered until he could not. His practiced sincerity thinned with each question like paint wearing off a surface to reveal whatever waited underneath. Jolene spoke until her voice tightened and the tears that had been decorative became real in a way she clearly had not anticipated. The story they had maintained for 18 months began to come apart. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with a confession or an outburst. It came apart the way all carefully constructed lies eventually come apart when they are placed beside carefully assembled truth. Slowly, quietly, one fact at a time, until the structure could no longer hold its own weight, and the people holding it up found themselves standing in the rubble with nothing left to say. Decisions were made. Temporary protective measures for Hilda. An ongoing investigation into the property transfers and financial management. A formal review of her medication records. And until further notice, Nova would remain with Callum under provisional authorization, his welfare deemed inseparable from the case that had brought this room full of people to their feet on a Wednesday afternoon in winter. Outside, dusk settled over the town in shades of blue and white. Neighbors lingered on the steps of the municipal hall, speaking in voices that carried the particular weight of people reckoning with what they had failed to see. Some offered Ruth quiet apologies. Others simply stood and watched as Callum helped Hilda into the car arranged for her transport Nova, sitting between them on the seat, calm and alert, as if the work of the day was finished, and he was satisfied with how it had gone. Callum stood alone for a moment after the car pulled away. Snow was beginning again, light and tentative, the kind of snow that falls after a storm has passed, and the sky is trying to remember how to be gentle. Ruth appeared beside him. She did not speak immediately. They stood together in the cold, watching the snow settle on the cars and the sidewalks and the rooftops of a town that was waking up to what had been happening in its own backyard. "My daughter called," Ruth said. Callum looked at her. "This morning, before the meeting, I almost did not answer because I did not recognize the number." She pulled her coat tighter. "She said she heard about what happened to Hilda. She said she had been thinking. She said she wanted to talk." Ruth's voice caught on the last word, held, then steadied. "It is not an apology. It is not forgiveness. It is a phone call. But it is the first one in 7 years." She looked at Callum with eyes that were wet but steady. "Small things," she said. "That is how it starts." She walked to her car. Callum watched her go. The weeks that followed moved at the pace of thawing ice, slowly, irreversibly, with small sounds of breaking that meant not destruction but release. Callum still ran most evenings, his boots finding the familiar rhythm on the river path. But the run had changed. It was no longer a sprint away from memory. It had become something quieter, a way to greet the day's end, a way to keep the body honest while the mind practiced the unfamiliar work of staying present. Nova trotted beside him. His gait was still young, still carrying the earnest clumsiness of a body growing faster than its coordination could follow, but there was confidence in it now. He checked the ground ahead, glanced up at Callum, then returned to his work. A partnership established without command. Hilda watched them from her window when they passed her street. She was home wearing a soft sweater instead of a hospital blanket. Her hair brushed her eyes brighter than they had been in months. The house breathed differently now. Photographs had been turned upright. Drawers opened and closed freely. Light fell where it pleased. Neighbors visited not from obligation, but with casseroles and newspapers and the unhurried conversations of people making up for lost time. Ruth sat with Hilda most afternoons, 2 women drinking tea at a kitchen table that had been a controlled space for 18 months and was now simply a kitchen table again. They talked about gardens and weather and the particular stubbornness of dogs who refused to let their people disappear. Sometimes they sat in silence, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that only happens between people who have learned that presence does not require performance. Callum's house had changed too, though a visitor might not notice at first glance. The furniture remained spare. The walls still carried the quiet order of a man used to living with only what he needed. But near the door, on the nail where he hung his keys, A second object now caught the light each time the door opened. Nova's old collar mended carefully, the break left visible on purpose. Callum had cleaned it and hung it there not as a reminder of what had been broken, but as proof that some things do not end where they seem to. He touched it each morning before stepping outside. The gesture was small, automatic. It grounded him in the present the way an anchor holds a boat, not by preventing movement, but by providing a fixed point to return to. Nova sensed these pauses before they happened. Whenever Callum's hand slowed near the collar, the puppy would step forward and press his nose against Callum's palm. Not urgently, not anxiously, just enough contact to say here and now and still. On a morning when the snow had lightened to a thin drifting fall and the sky showed the first pale suggestion that winter might eventually remember how to end, Callum took Nova back to the bench by the river. The same bench, the same bare oak. The river moved beneath its thinning ice, patient and unremarkable, carrying the season forward the way rivers carry everything, without commentary, without judgment, simply onward. Callum sat. Nova settled beside him, both ears upright, both eyes bright. From his pocket, Callum took the old collar. He held it for a moment, turning it once in his hands. It looked smaller than he remembered, less heavy. A thing that had done its part and could now be set down. He placed it gently on the bench between them. Then he reached into his jacket and brought out a new collar. Simple, strong, the right size. He clipped it around Nova's neck, adjusting the fit with careful fingers until it sat just right, snug, but not tight secure, without restraint. Nova shook once the way dogs shake when something shifts, and the body needs a moment to resettle around the change. Then he sat again, ears lifted, eyes on Callum tail, giving a single confident arc that needed no translation. "Ready?" Callum said softly. He was not sure who he was speaking to. Himself, perhaps? Or the memory of a woman who had knelt on cold sidewalks to greet every lost creature she encountered. Or the old woman who had buried a letter in frozen ground and waited. Or the puppy who had refused to stop breathing on the worst night of his short life, and in doing so, had pulled a grieving man back from the edge of a silence that had nearly swallowed him whole. All of them, maybe. All of them at once. They walked home together, leaving the bench behind, the snow already beginning to soften its edges. The collar lay where he had placed it, a small object holding a large story, slowly disappearing under the white, the way all difficult things eventually do when they are given permission to rest. Dawn arrived quietly the next morning, pale light over white ground. Callum laced his boots. Nova waited by the door, tail low, but eager ears up ready. They stepped outside into cold air that carried for the first time in months something that was not quite warmth, but was no longer entirely winter. Their breath rose in twin clouds. The day opened ahead of them without demand or promise, asking nothing except that they move through it together. There are small lives that do not arrive to be rescued. They arrive to rescue others in ways so quiet they are almost missed. A paw placed over a trembling hand, a nose pressed into a grieving man's palm, a heartbeat that refuses to stop when every reasonable measure says it should. Sometimes the miracle is not thunder and light. Sometimes it is the smallest breath in the coldest dark, holding on for one more minute and then one more, until the footsteps finally come.